On a gray morning in March of 2009, a loan officer named Dale Bruner sat across a kitchen table in Fillmore County, Minnesota, and told a 31-year-old man named Wendell Hartig that the smartest thing he could do. He had the numbers in a manila folder, and he laid them out the way a doctor lays out a chart: 210 acres, a note of $412,000, 90 days until the bank moved to auction. Brunner was not a cruel man. He genuinely believed he was being kind. He tapped a pen against a column of red figures and said that corn was corn, that beans were beans, and that a man growing what nobody else grew was a man who had not yet accepted what the market had already decided. 14 years later, in the fall of 2023, a buyer from a seed preservation cooperative wrote Wendell a single check for one season of one crop grown on 40 of those same acres in the amount of $386,000. The land was paid off by then. The note was a memory, and the thing that had carried him across those 14 years was sitting in a tin bread box on a shelf in the mudroom, a stack of brittle paper held together with a rubber band, a hand-lettered catalog of seeds his grandmother had kept for 60 years. Let me tell you about the span between those two numbers, because it is not a story about luck. It is a story about two kinds of knowing, and which one the world pays for, and which one keeps you alive when the world stops paying. Wendell Hartig was known in Fillmore County for two things. He was quiet, to the point that people sometimes mistook it for slowness, and he could tell you, by the feel of the soil crumbling between his fingers, whether a field was ready 3 days before the moisture meter agreed. He had taken over the home place from his father, Orrin, who had taken it from his mother, a woman named Greta, who had come from a farming village in Germany in 1931 with a leather satchel and inside it 40 paper packets of seed. The neighbors had always grown what the elevator wanted. Greta grew what she remembered. And when she died in 1994, what she left was not money. It was the bread box and the catalog, and a granddaughter's husband who happened to be the only one in the family who had ever bothered to listen to her in the garden. The farm in 2009 was a hard place to love by conventional measures. The equipment was old. The barn leaned a few degrees off true and had leaned that way since Wendell was a boy. The fields were not the clean, rectangular monocultures of his neighbors, 400 acres of one hybrid corn marching to every fence line. Wendell's ground was broken into odd parcels, a few acres of one thing, a few of another, strips of squash and dry beans, and a stubborn old flint corn that nobody at the elevator would take, because it did not match any grade in their book. To Dale Bruner, sitting at that table with his folder, it looked like a man playing in a garden while the real farmers around him got on with the business of agriculture. To Wendell, it was the only inheritance that had ever mattered. They were looking at the same fields. They were not seeing the same thing. Bruner finished his coffee and stood and put on his coat. At the door, he turned and offered the kindness he had been building toward the whole visit. He said there was no shame in it, that the bank had programs, that a man of Wendell's age could still go get on with one of the big operations down by the river and draw a steady wage. He called it a hobby farm. He said the word hobby the way you would say it to a child who had built something out of mud and was proud of it. Then he drove off in a clean white sedan that had never once had gravel dust settle into its door seams, and Wendell stood in the mudroom for a long time with his hand on the lid of the bread box. I want you to stay with this one, because the thing that saved this farm is a thing almost everyone reading this has thrown away without knowing what it was. Think about that as we go. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the satchel and the woman who carried it. Greta Hartig had grown up in a village where the same families had grown the same crops on the same ground for 300 years, and where a particular kind of squash or a particular bean was not a commodity but a possession handed down a household, the way a name is handed down. When the bad years came to that village in the late 1922, the families who survived were not the ones with the most land. They were the ones whose seed had been bred, season after season, to the exact temperament of that exact valley, its frosts and its droughts and its particular blights. Greta watched her own grandmother save seed from the plants that shrugged off the dry year, and only those, and replant them the next spring, and do it again and again, until the seed itself remembered the dry years and was ready for the next one. That was the knowledge she put in the satchel. Not the seeds alone, discipline of choosing. When she reached Minnesota, she found a country that was racing in the opposite direction. The new science said uniformity. It said, buy your seed fresh each year from a company that had bred it for yield in a laboratory. Plant it in clean rows and do not save your own, because the saved seed of a hybrid does not come true. There was real power in that science and real food in it, and Greta was not a fool who denied it. She simply kept her own counsel and her own packets, and every year she planted a corner of the garden the old way, saving seed from the best, writing in a school notebook what each variety had done that year. Wet spring, held against the August heat, lost half to the squash bug, so do not save from this row, year after year, 60 years of it. By the time she was an old woman, the notebook had become a catalog, hand-lettered, each variety with its own page, its history, its weaknesses, its gifts. Let me tell you what that catalog actually was, because this is the part the loan officer could not see. It was not a list of plants. It was 60 years of decisions compressed. Every page held the memory of which strain had survived a specific hardship, and that memory was bred into the living seed itself. The seeds in those packets were not generic. They were a flint corn that had been selected for 6 decades on one farm to ripen fully before the first hard frost of that one county. They were a dry bean that had been chosen year after year from the plants that held their pods through drought. To a seed company, they were nothing, because they could not be patented and would not yield as much in a wet year as the hybrids. To the right buyer, 14 years later, they would be close to priceless. That buyer did not exist yet in 2009, though. In 2009, there was only a leaning barn, a manila folder, and 90 days Wendell did the arithmetic that night at the kitchen table with his wife, Marta, under the single hanging bulb. The numbers were brutal and honest. To make the next payment, he needed roughly $14,000 in 90 days, and to stop the auction entirely. He needed to convince the bank he had a real plan, not a hobby. He had 140 acres he could plant in conventional corn and beans like everyone else. And even in a good year, that ground, after seed and chemical and fuel and the share that went to the note, would not come close. Conventional farming at his scale was a slow way to lose the farm. He had watched it happen to better men. The big operations could survive on thin margins because they ran 10,000 acres. He could not. Competing with them on their own terms was the surest road to the auction. The bank was already planning. Marta was the one who said the thing out loud. She had been a schoolteacher before they married, careful with words, and she chose these carefully. She said the bank wanted him to grow what everyone grew, and everyone who grew it at their size was drowning, and maybe the answer was not to row harder in the same water. Maybe the answer was the breadbox. Wendell did not say much. He almost never did. He got up and took the tin down from the mudroom shelf and set it on the table between them and took off the rubber band, and they spent until 2 in the morning turning the brittle pages under the bulb, reading 60 years of a dead woman's handwriting, while a dog named Pim, an old black and white farm dog gone gray at the muzzle, slept against Wendell's boot and dreamed and twitched. What they found in the catalog was not a rescue. It was a thread. One page, near the back, was given over to a variety Greta had called by a German name that translated roughly to gold of the valley, a flint corn with a deep amber kernel, and beside it in the margin she had written a single English sentence in a younger hand. The chefs will want this someday. Wendell did not know what it meant. Greta had never explained it. There was a phone number written below it, though, decades old, and a name, and that thread was the only thing in the manila folder of his life that pointed anywhere but down. Now, I told you this was a story about 2 kinds of knowing, and here is where they first came into the same room. Because Wendell's nephew came home that spring. His name was Cole. He was 24, and he had just finished a degree in agricultural economics at the university. And he loved his uncle, and was mortified by him in roughly equal measure. Cole arrived in a hatchback full of textbooks, with a head full of yield curves and commodity futures, intending, in the kind way of the young and educated, to save the old man with a spreadsheet. He sat at the same kitchen table where Brunner had sat, and he opened a laptop and he showed Wendell, in colored bars, exactly what the loan officer had shown him in red ink. The math was the math. Specialty crops were a boutique distraction. The path to solvency, Cole said, was scale and efficiency, contract acres, maybe custom work for the big neighbors to bring in cash. He used the word optimize. He used it the way his professors had used it, as though it were a moral position. Wendell listened to all of it the way he listened to weather on the radio, attentively and without argument, and when Cole was done, he pushed the bread box across the table and asked the boy to read him the page about the flint corn. Cole read it. He read the German name and the amber kernel and the line about the chefs, and he gave a short laugh, not unkind, and said that was exactly the sentimental thinking that lost farms. Then he said the word that would get said 3 times. In this story, each time by someone who meant it, each time a little less sure. He said it was folk wisdom charming. Folk wisdom did not service a $400,000 note, though Wendell put the rubber band back around the catalog. He said one sentence. He said the bank's wisdom did not service it either, and at least the folk wisdom was free. Then he went out to start the planting. Let me tell you what he planted, because this is the teaching part, and it matters that you understand the mechanism, or the reveal at the end will feel like magic instead of arithmetic. Wendell did not bet the whole farm on the catalog. That would have been a fool's move, and he was not a fool, only stubborn in a particular direction. He planted 100 acres of conventional corn and beans, the safe drowning to keep the bank from panicking and to keep some cash flowing. On 40 of his oddest acres, though the broken parcels nobody wanted, he planted Greta's seed, the gold of the valley flint and the drought bean, and 3 kinds of winter squash that had been selected on that ground for 60 years. He did it the old way, by hand in places, saving back enough seed to plant again, because the whole point of the catalog was that the seed came true. Hybrids do not. A hybrid is bred from 2 parent lines and gives you 1 good generation, and if you save its seed, it scatters into 100 weak grandchildren. Greta's seed was open-pollinated, stabilized over decades, which means it bred true, which means every kernel he saved was both next year's crop and a piece of capital he did not have to buy. The seed companies had made saving illegal or pointless for most of American agriculture. Greta had quietly opted out of the whole arrangement 60 years before, and her opting out was now the only equity Wendell owned free and clear. That summer was the first hinge. Let me tell you about the neighbor, because his story runs alongside Wendell's the whole way, and you need to feel them diverge. His name was Russ Lindgren, and he farmed 800 acres on the other side of the township road, and he was, by every measure, Dale Brunner respected, doing everything right. Russ had borrowed against good years to buy a new self-propelled sprayer, $90,000 of gleaming machine, and a planter that could put down 24 rows at once, and he farmed one hybrid corn fence to fence with the discipline of a man, following the best advice money could buy. Russ was not a villain. He was Wendell's friend. They had baled hay together as boys. When Russ saw Wendell out hand-planting squash on his odd acres that spring, he stopped his truck on the road and rolled down the window. And they talked the way old friends do, and Russ told him, gently, that he was breaking his heart out there, that he should come run a few thousand acres with the co-op and quit killing himself over a garden. He meant it as love. He drove off in a truck that cost more than Wendell's house to the bank. Russ was the model, and Wendell was the cautionary tale. Hold that picture. We are going to need it. The first season, the catalog crop did not save anything. I want to be honest about that, because the real version of this story is slow, and the channels that tell you these things happen overnight are lying to you. Wendell harvested his 40 acres of old varieties in the fall of 2009 and had a barn full of beautiful amber flint corn and heritage squash and dry beans, and almost no one to sell them to. The elevator would not grade the flint. It did not match. He sold squash at 3 farmers' markets and to a co-op grocery in Rochester, and he made enough, just barely, scraping with the conventional acres to make the payment that kept the auction from happening that first 90 days. The bank extended him grudgingly because he had made the number, and Dale Brunner shook his hand at the door and said, in that same kind voice, that he hoped Wendell had gotten the garden out of his system and would plant sensible next year. He had not gotten it out of his system. He had planted the thread, and the thread was holding barely, and he meant to follow it. Here is where Cole began to turn, and I want to show it to you in stages, because conversion is never a single moment, whatever the loud stories tell you. Cole had stayed on through the summer, partly out of love and partly because the job market for new Ag Econ graduates in 2009 was a cruelty all its own. He worked the conventional acres and grumbled about the garden. And then one evening in late August, he was helping Wendell rogue the flint corn, walking the rows, pulling out any plant that did not match, any ear that had crossed or come up weak, so that only the best went back into the seed stock. Cole asked why they were throwing away perfectly good corn. Wendell handed him Greta's catalog, opened to the flint page, and told him to read the column of years down the margin. 60 entries. Cole read them, and somewhere around the 15th year of a dead woman's notes about which plants had held against which drought, the economist in him went quiet, and a different thing woke up. He saw, maybe for the first time, that this was data. It was 60 years of single-variable field trials, selection under real conditions, the kind of longitudinal dataset his professors would have killed for and could never have funded. He did not say any of this out loud. He just kept walking the rows. And he stopped grumbling, and Wendell, who noticed everything and said almost nothing, let him be. Now let me tell you what happened next, because the thread led somewhere. That winter, Wendell called the decades-old phone number from the margin of the catalog. The name beside it had been a man, long retired, but his daughter answered, and she ran a small grain company that supplied heritage flours to bakeries and a handful of restaurants in the Twin Cities and Chicago. Her name was Iris Vance. She had spent her career on exactly the thing the loan officer thought was a hobby, the rebuilding of regional grain economies that the commodity system had wiped out, and when Wendell described the gold of the Valley Flint, the deep amber kernel, 60 years of selection on one farm in Fillmore County, she asked him to send her 2 pounds. He mailed it the next morning in a padded envelope, 2 pounds of a dead woman's patience, and then there was nothing to do but wait through the winter and plant again in the spring and hope the thread did not break. It is the spring of 2010 now. Cole stayed. That alone told you something. He enrolled the farm in Nothing Took Out No New Loans, and instead spent the off months building on his own laptop. A real accounting of the heritage acres against the conventional ones, a true cost comparison, because he had stopped trying to disprove his uncle and started trying to understand him. What the numbers showed him unsettled the entire frame he had brought home from the university. The conventional 100 acres run correctly, by the book, threw off a margin so thin that a single bad input price, or a wet October, could erase it. The heritage, 40, even sold clumsily at farmers' markets, was already netting more per acre because Wendell was not buying seed, was barely buying chemical, and was selling into a market where his product was not one identical bushel among 10 billion, but a thing no one else on earth had. Cole had been taught that scale was the answer to thin margins. He was looking at a spreadsheet that said the answer was to stop competing on margin at all. He brought it to Wendell at the kitchen table, the colored bars reversed now, and Wendell looked at it a while and said only that Greta had known that without a laptop. Cole did not laugh this time. I will step out of the story for one moment because some of you watching have a thing in your own family, like that bread box, a recipe, a skill, a way of doing something that the world has told you is worthless, and I would like you to leave a note about it below if you do. Just a word, because I think there are more of these threads still alive than anyone counts. Now, back to the farm, and to the year the weather decided the argument. The structural reckoning came in 2012, and it did not announce itself as a rescue. It came as a disaster, the way these things do, and it fell on the just and the unjust alike, except that it did not quite, and the difference is the whole point. The summer of 2012 brought the worst drought the upper Midwest had seen in a generation. It came on slow in June and then would not break week after week of high sun and no rain, the kind of dry that cracks the ground into plates and sends heat shimmering off fields at midday. Let me tell you what a drought does to a hybrid monoculture, because the mechanism is precise and it is brutal. A modern hybrid is bred for maximum yield under good conditions, and it is bred to be uniform, every plant pollinating in the same narrow window. When a heat wave hits during that window, the pollen dies, the silks dry, and the ears do not fill. The whole field, being uniform, fails in the same way at the same time. Uniformity, which is efficiency in a good year, becomes a single point of failure in a bad one. The entire crop is betting on the same weather. Russ Lindgren watched his 800 acres of one hybrid burn down to nothing across July. I will not dwell on it cruelly because there was nothing funny in it, and the narrator who laughs at a man's ruin has lost the thread of why this matters. Russ stood at his fence line in August with the gleaming sprayer parked behind him, $90,000 of machine over a field not worth harvesting, and he watched the heat take the year. End. He pulled an ear from the nearest stalk and stripped the husk back with his thumb, the way a man does 10,000 times in a life, and the cob underneath was half bare, the kernels gapped and shrunken where the pollen had failed in July, and he stood there turning it over in his hand for a long time before he let it drop into the dust. He had done everything, the experts told him. That was the bitter part. He had been the good student. The crop insurance would cover some of it, and the bank would carry him another year. But the new equipment notes did not pause for drought, and a man who has financed efficiency discovers in a dry year that he has financed fragility and is paying interest on it. By the end of that summer, Russ had quietly listed 200 acres. The auction the bank had planned for Wendell in 2009 found a different address. Across the township road, Greta's seed did what it had been bred for 60 years to do. The drought bean held its pods. The gold of the valley flint, selected for decade after decade from the plants that ripened earliest and stood the dry years, did not pollinate in a single narrow window, because it was not uniform. It was a population with genetic variation built into it, and when the heat killed the pollen on the earliest plants, the later ones were still coming. And the field hedged its own bet the way a diverse thing always does. The squash, deep-rooted and old, pulled moisture the hybrids could not reach. Wendell's 40 heritage acres did not give a record yield. They gave a yield. In a year when the county average for corn fell by half and many fields gave nothing at all, Wendell brought in a harvest, smaller than a wet year, but whole, of a crop that was now suddenly, in a drought-shocked region, rarer than it had ever been. He did not celebrate. He walked the rows with Pim at his heel, the old dog slower now, and he saved his seed, the best of the drought survivors, the way Greta had taught, because the seed that had just come through 2012 was worth more in the bread box than it had ever been. Let me tell you about Cole that autumn, because the conversion finished here, not in a speech, but in an act. Cole had a job offer, by then a real one, a commodity desk in Minneapolis, the exact career the degree had been, for a salary and a city and a future with no leaning barn in it. He turned it down. He did not make a scene of it. He simply called the company and declined, and then went out to help his uncle bag seed corn in the cold barn, and when Wendell raised an eyebrow, which was as close as Wendell came to a question, Cole said he had run the numbers, and the numbers said stay. It was a joke, and it was not. He had become, over 3 seasons, the thing the story needed him to become, not a man who abandoned the spreadsheet, but a man who finally pointed it at the right field. He understood the mechanism now. He could explain it in the language of the university. Genetic diversity as risk management, open pollinated seed as retained equity, a regional specialty market as an escape from commodity price-taking, and that translation was about to matter because the thread that Iris Vance had picked up 2 years before was finally about to pull taut. Which brings us back to Iris, and to the slow good news that had been building under the surface while the drought did its loud work above it. The 2 pounds of flint Wendell had mailed in 2010 had been milled, tested, and baked, and it turned out the deep amber kernel that no elevator would grade carried a flavor and a flour quality that the commodity system had spent a century breeding out of corn in favor of yield. Iris had been selling small lots of that flour to bakeries who paid attention, and a few chefs who paid more, and the demand had grown slowly. And then after 2012, when so much regional grain simply vanished from the drought, sharply. Greta's margin note had not been sentiment. The chefs will want this someday. She had been right by 60 years. Iris drove down to the farm in the fall of 2012, walked the rows, ran the amber kernels through her fingers the way Wendell did, and stood a long while in the cold barn looking at the bags of saved seed stacked to the rafters. She did not haggle. People who know the worth of a rare thing rarely do, and Iris had spent her whole life learning exactly what this one was worth. The real reveal, though, the number that this whole story has been walking toward did not come from the flower, even though the flower kept the farm alive and paid the note down year over year through the middle of the decade. It came later, and it came from the seed itself, and it came because of exactly the thing Cole had seen in the rows that first August, that the catalog was not a list of plants, but a 60-year selection trial. And the seed that survived 2012 was the most drought-adapted regional flint corn in existence. And there were institutions whose entire purpose was to find and preserve exactly that. Let me tell you how it actually happened, because the moment deserves to be told slowly. In the late summer of 2023, a seed preservation cooperative that worked with regional growers and a national seed bank sent 2 people down to Fillmore County. By then, Wendell was in his middle 40s, and the farm was whole, the note long since gone, and Cole farmed beside him as a partner. And they had spent 11 years, not just growing Greta's varieties, but stewarding them, expanding the seed stock, keeping the catalog going in a new hand in the same school notebooks. The cooperative had been tracking down surviving open-pollinated grain varieties with documented, multi-decade selection histories, because in an era of a changing climate, seed that had been bred by hand to survive hard, specific conditions on real ground was no longer a curiosity. It was infrastructure. It was a hedge against a future nobody could model, and there were almost none left. The commodity system had done its work too well. Most of the old varieties had been lost, eaten, forgotten, plowed under for one more season of hybrid. The 2 from the cooperative sat at the same kitchen table where Dale Bruner had sat in 2009, under the same hanging bulb, and they laid out not a manila folder, but a contract. They wanted to license and propagate the gold of the Valley Flint and 2 of the drought beans, with Wendell and Cole as the source growers and stewards, the seed to be preserved in the National Bank, and grown out under their care, the documented 63-year selection history made part of the permanent record. They had a figure for the first season alone, for the seed stock and the propagation rights and the growing contract on 40 acres. Cole, who handled the numbers now, read the figure off the page in a level voice because his uncle had taught him that you do not flinch at a number, you let it sit in the room and be what it is. $386,000 for one season, for one crop, grown on the same 40-odd acres that Dale Bruner had called a hobby 14 years before. Nobody said anything for a moment. The bulb hummed. Outside, a younger dog, Pim's successor, barked once at something in the yard and went quiet. Wendell looked at the number, and then he looked out the window toward the mudroom, where the bread box still sat on its shelf. And the only thing he said, the only thing, was that Greta should have been at the table. End quote. Then he got up and put the coffee on. Because the cows did not know about the contract and would want feeding either way. I have thought a long time about why that number lands the way it does. It was never really payment for a season of corn. It was the market, 14 years late, finally pricing a kind of knowledge it had spent a century insisting was worthless. The bank in 2009 had valued the farm at $412,000 of debt against dirt and a leaning barn. It had assigned a value of 0 to the bread box, because the bread box could not be collateralized, could not be graded, did not appear in any column Dale Bruner had been trained to read. And the bread box turned out to be worth, in a single season, very nearly the whole of that debt. The two kinds of knowing had been in the room the whole time. One of them had a spreadsheet and a clean white sedan and the full confidence of the institution behind it. The other was a stack of brittle paper held with a rubber band. The drought decided between them. It always does, eventually. The only question is whether you are still on the land when it does. Dale Bruner, I am glad to tell you, lived to see it. And the way he met it is the part of this story I am most fond of, because it is the part that keeps it from being a story about revenge. Brunner was near retirement by 2023, and he had stayed in the county, and he had heard, the way everyone in a county hears about the Heirloom contract. He did something a smaller man would not have. He drove out to the farm one afternoon in a sedan a good deal older than the one from 2009, and he found Wendell in the barn, and he stood in the door a while, and then he said plainly that he had been wrong, and that he had thought about it over the years, and that he had been measuring the wrong thing the whole time. He asked Wendell to explain it to him, not to defend it, to explain it, so that he could understand and Wendell, who had never once said, "I told you so," who had not gloated when the drought took Russ's crop or when the contract came, set down what he was doing and walked Dale Brunner out to the 40 acres and showed him the flint corn ear by ear, and told him about the narrow pollination window and the genetic variation and the 63 years of choosing, and the loan officer, who had once called it a hobby, stood in the rows and listened to a farmer teach. And that was the recalibration, quiet and complete. The expert became the student. No one was humiliated. A man simply updated, late, the way honest men do. Let me tell you what Wendell did with the money, because the moral of a story like this is never in the getting. He paid off what little remained. And he did not buy a new truck, and he did not buy more land, though he could have. He kept the operation right-sized to what those acres and 2 pairs of hands could steward well, because the whole lesson of Greta's catalog was that bigger is not stronger, that diversity and attention beat scale and speed at the time horizon that matters. He bought back the 200 acres Russ Lindgren had lost in 2012 when they came up for sale, and he sold them back to Russ on a handshake note at no interest, payable whenever, because Russ had been a good student of bad advice and did not deserve the ruin that found him, and because a neighbor on the land is worth more than a number in an account. Russ farms it still, in heritage varieties now, having learned the hard way what the dry years teach. And Wendell and Cole began deliberately to give the catalog away. They grew out seed and sold it cheap or gave it free to any young farmer in the region who wanted to try the old varieties, and they wrote the growing notes down for them, and they took the school notebooks that Greta had started in 1934, and Cole had a copy made of every page and lodged with the seed bank, so that if the leaning barn ever burned, 63 years of choosing would not burn with it. The catalog goes on. That is the thing I most want you to take from this. Greta Hartig saved seed for 60 years not to get rich, because she never did and never tried to, but because she came from a place that had learned, through famine, that a people who keep their own seed, keep their own future, and a people who hand that work to a distant company have handed away something they do not understand the value of until the dry year comes. She put that knowledge in a satchel and carried it across an ocean in a century and set it down in a bread box in a mudroom in Minnesota, and it waited there, worth nothing by every measure the world used, until the day it was worth everything. Wendell did not save the farm with the seed catalog. The seed catalog was the farm. The dirt and the barn were just where he kept it. Here is the thing about the two kinds of knowledge laid out plainly now because we have earned it. The first kind is wide and shallow and confident. It knows a little about 10,000 acres, and it can tell you the yield curve of a hybrid and the price of a bushel in Chicago and the interest on a note, and it is genuinely powerful, and it built the abundance most of us live inside, and it is not the enemy. It measures only what is easy to count, though, and it mistakes the things it cannot measure for things that are not there. The second kind is narrow and deep and patient. It knows one piece of ground the way you know a face. It cannot tell you the price of corn in Chicago, but it can tell you 3 days early that a field is ready, and it can hand you a seed that remembers a drought from before you were born. The first kind wrote the manila folder. The second kind was in the bread box. And when the weather finally asked the only question that ever truly matters, which is not what will you yield in a good year, but what will you have left in a bad one, it was the patient, narrow, deep, dismissed kind of knowing that answered, and the farm is still there because of it. What is rigid breaks? What remembers, endures? The bread box is still on the shelf in the mudroom. The rubber band has been replaced more times than anyone has counted, and the original pages are sealed now in archival sleeves at Cole's insistence. But a working copy still sits in the tin where a German woman first set it down, and every winter, at the same kitchen table under the same bulb. And an old man and a younger one open it and read the year that just passed into it, the wet spring or the dry August, which Rose held and which to save from adding, their hand to her hand, choosing the way she taught, the way the dry years require, the dog asleep against a boot, the seed in its packets in the dark, remembering everything it has survived, and waiting patient, as it has always been, for the spring.